Hi all and welcome back to another video. In today's video we're going to be trying out the Fuji Weekly Portra recipe and comparing it to Real Portra film. I've actually done this now a couple of times. I've used some of the Fuji emulations to do this video, so if you're interested in seeing how Acros or Velvia emulations compared to the real film stocks, I'll link those videos down in the description. Now I think before we get too far into this video I should probably set out some ground rules and my approach to this video. The camera from a digital point of view that I was using was this. This is the Fuji X100V, and I was actually using the wide angle converter on this camera so that the focal length matched the Leica. From a Fuji Weekly recipe point of view, I was actually using the V2 version of the recipe. I'll stick the settings up on the screen now. If you've never used Fuji Weekly before, I recommend that you hop over to that website and check out some of these recipes that they've got that you can build into your camera. They're an awful lot of fun and I've absolutely loved trying them out. From a film point of view, I was using this, which is my Leica M6 and the 28mm Voigtlander Ultron. I've used this lens before, lots and lots, and I love the lens, and it means that the focal length between these two cameras matched whilst shooting the video. From a film point of view, things do get a little bit murky when it comes to developing and processing. For me personally, I develop the film myself using cine still chemicals. I then scan it using my Epson V600. I then convert it using Negative Lab Pro, and then I import them into Lightroom, and I use the auto white balance in Lightroom to balance my images. I guess my point is that the film images have had different software interpreting the images to get the images that I am used to seeing. Therefore, your results may vary slightly and your portrait look from film might actually look slightly different to mine. In terms of the location, if you've watched my previous video on the Olympus OM4 Ti, you'll know that Claire and I took a holiday down to Brighton. I really enjoyed this trip, and this second day of the trip is honestly one of my highlights of the year. All we did was took a walk up the Brighton coastline, but the sun was absolutely beaming down even though it was late October, resulting in some of my favourite images of this year. I'd actually been waiting for a sunny day to do this video, as I find both film and with the recipes, because they are both fixed colour balances, that shooting in bright daylight, it gets you some of the best results with both. Now first up, I think we should probably talk about the colour balance difference between these images, as it's a theme that stretches across just about every image in this video, and it's a bit of a funny subject really. Now I personally find that the recipe has slightly too much of a green tint to it. Now green tint is something that generally you do associate with film images, however my experience shooting portrait is that the green tint isn't normally there. If anything, I find when shooting portrait you end up with slightly warm images, and if anything the tint is slightly more towards purple than it is towards green. If we actually take a look at the setting in the recipe, the setting for colour balance is at 5200 Kelvin, which is direct sunlight. That's quite a white light and it doesn't really have a warm or cold hue to it. However, the adjustment on that is just +1 red and -6 blue. And I find it's that -6 blue that's just a little bit too strong. If you have a look at some of these images just taken outside of my garden, as I increase that -6 blue back up, you'll see that green tint starts to disappear. And I think it's this setting that it's just gone slightly too strong with. Interestingly, if you have a look at the difference between the V1 and the V2 recipe, one of the biggest differences is how they handle this color balance difference. The old V1 recipe has a less exaggerated setting here, and I find that the old settings are actually a little bit closer to Real Portra. These images from around the Brighton Pavilion don't quite hit the mark for me for some reason. I think I underexposed the film a little bit, which left the shadows looking a little bit harsh and not easy to recover in post. It looks like the lenses on both of these cameras also flared a little bit, which leaves a slightly odd looking contrast to the images. Next up, I think we should probably take a look at the dynamic range differences between the images. Now, there is two settings going on here that are having an effect on this. One of them is the tone curve. The tone curve is set to highlight 0 and shadows -2. And what that's doing is it's not touching the highlights, which I think is a pretty good idea. Leave the highlight worrying around to the photographer. But from a shadows point of view, that -2 is crushing the shadows a little bit. It's bringing them up so that there's not a lot of pure black in the image. Along with that, we also have the dynamic range setting, which is set to 400. And what Fuji's doing there is it's actually slightly underexposing the JPEG to protect the highlights. Then it then boosts the brightness in post to bring up the shadows a little bit as well. That way you get more dynamic range. I think overall this flattening kind of look to the images is perfect, and it is what you want to do to emulate film. However, I think the film has slightly more kind of shadow contrast in it. And personally, I don't think I would actually change either of these two settings. There's a setting that we're going to talk about a little bit later on that would be the one that I would change to try and counter this back a little bit. You know, sometimes when you take a photo that isn't that great, but for some reason the colours just really suck you in. This is one of them for me. There's nothing that special about this image, but there's just something about the light and the colours that really draw me in. And I think the two cameras actually match up pretty well here. Let's quickly run through some of the other settings then that are in the Fuji recipe. One of those is Color +2. I think Color +2 is about right. Color is affecting the saturation in the image, and I think the saturation matches up pretty well. Another one is Sharpness -2. Now what that's doing is it's just reducing some of the in-camera sharpness that is applied to the JPEGs. Now I find the Fuji X100V to be a very, very sharp camera. The lens on this is incredible, especially wide open, and that's great and one of my favorite features of this camera, but when you're trying to emulate film, you sometimes don't want that clinical sharpness. So I think having a minor sharpness number on there is the right thing to do. I think maybe I would go a little bit further than -2. I think I might go to -4, -5, just to kind of emphasize that effect even more. Another setting is noise reduction on -4. This means that there is barely any noise reduction being applied to the image, which again I think is very good when it comes to replicating film. One of the other settings is clarity on -2, and I said this a little bit earlier that the images are already quite flat, and having that clarity on -2 I think is just adding a little bit too much to the effect. Also, when you have changed the clarity setting, that means there's a delay every time you take an image. Personally, I would put this setting back to 0. It's a win-win. I think the image looks a little bit closer to Portra, and you no longer have to worry about every time you take a picture, there's a couple second lag before you can carry on using your camera. I love this image from both cameras. I have corrected the perspective a little bit on the film image to make the viewing tower straight, but the tones and colours I think have come out looking so good in both of these cameras. But does any of this really matter? Now hear me out for a second, because I have a feeling that the guys at Fuji Weekly did not set out trying to perfectly emulate Portra. Instead, I think they were trying to make a recipe that had that Portra and film-like feel to it. Because does this image on the screen now look like, at a glance, that it could have been taken on a film camera? I think generally the answer to that question is yes, but this was actually taken on a digital camera with 0 editing done in post. And I'm pointing this out because this recipe, along with the Kodachrome recipe, are my two most used color recipes on my camera, and I use them all of the time. Even if I'm shooting RAW, I will leave RAW and JPEG on just so I get these files that are really easy to send using the app to my phone and post on social media. Most of my story posts are taken on this camera with 0 editing done. And it's for that reason that I absolutely love these Fuji Weekly presets, regardless of if they're a perfect match to the film. These images next are some of my favourite portraits that I've taken of Claire this year. We were really lucky to get this space to ourselves, and the way that the light's coming through and how the colours have come out have just made these images some of my favourites from the trip. These photos just before the sun is setting, looking out over the beach, and the old key hit me right in the feels. Sometimes with film, I feel like under the right circumstances, it just hits a little different. The tonality and colour here on pretty much unedited images are close to what I would call colour perfection. I know we all have different tastes, but for me, these are it. Having made this video and actually comparing the two images next to each other, what would I do slightly differently? I'll put the recipe up on the screen now with my changes. I think the main things that I would change is I would reduce that sharpness even more to get rid of some of that clinical sharpness of the X100V. I think I would actually reduce the effect of the colour balance a little bit. I'd add a little bit more red, so make it red 2, and make the blue -4, so not the -6 that it was previously. And then when it comes to clarity, like we were just saying towards the end there, I wouldn't set that to -2, I would put that back to 0, because it makes using the camera a lot nicer, and I think overall it kind of was a little bit too extreme in terms of image flatness. Like I said at the start of this video, this trip was honestly one of my favourites. The actual day itself with the bright sunny weather and being on the beach with some great company, honestly, it is a highlight of mine this year. I feel like some of the images as well have come out looking so good, and I cannot wait to get more of them printed. Finally, the last shot of the day after the sun had gone down. I like both images, and you can see that the film, I was having to shoot at f2 to get the exposure right, especially handheld. A fair amount of the image is out of focus compared to the digital, but I was able to lean on a slightly higher ISO. If you haven't already, and especially if it's not your first time here, then please consider liking and subscribing to the channel. I would love to have you along for the ride. If you've actually tried out this Portra recipe before, I'd be really interested to know your thoughts on it too, especially if you tweaked it. I'd love to know what you tweaked to kind of tailor it to your own tastes. And if you want to see a little bit more like this video, down in the description I'll have linked the Acros and Velvia video that I've already produced. Thank you guys for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one.